breath was a ragged whisper against the silence of the high plains, a sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent expanse. Her name was Ilara, and she lived in a cabin carved from stubborn earth and solitude, miles from the nearest semblance of civilization. The raw wind was her constant companion, and the distant, ever-present threat of the untamed wilderness, her silent dread. She had known the land's brutal lessons, had seen its capacity for swift, merciless change, but nothing had prepared her for the sight that greeted her at the edge of the creek bed that afternoon. A boy, no older than 10, lay crumpled amidst the thorny scrub, his skin a deep, rich brown, stark against the dust, and a dark stain blossoming on his worn buckskin. He was Comanche, unmistakably so, and wounded. The sight of him, so small and vulnerable, ripped through the hardened shell she had meticulously built around her heart. After years of loss and isolation, fear, cold and sharp, immediately pierced through the initial shock. This was not merely a boy. This was a symbol, a harbinger of conflict, a stark, living embodiment of the land's volatile history. Her own people, the few she occasionally encountered, held a deep, unyielding prejudice against the Comanche, a fear born of past raids and whispered legends. To shelter one was to invite catastrophe, to defy every unspoken law of survival on this desolate frontier. Yet as her gaze lingered on his pale, drawn face, a flicker of something else, something profoundly human, ignited within her. It was a silent plea for compassion, a desperate, unspoken challenge to the very prejudices that had shaped her world. The sun beat down, unyielding, on the boy's unmoving form, and the air grew thick with the unspoken question, what would she do? The creek murmured, an innocent witness to the monumental decision hovering in the harsh, dry air. She knew the consequences of either choice would be monumental, etching new lines onto the landscape of her solitary existence, irrevocably altering the fragile peace she had so fiercely guarded. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The decision was not a choice made in a moment of reckless heroism, but a surrender to an instinct she had long buried beneath layers of self-preservation. It was an almost involuntary movement, her feet carrying her towards the boy before her conscious mind could fully register the immense danger. As she knelt beside him, the scent of dust and dried blood was stark against the clean, sharp smell of the prairie. His breathing was shallow, a faint, precarious rhythm, and his small hand, surprisingly delicate, lay tangled in the dry grasses. There was a desperate fragility to him that bypassed her fear, striking at a primal chord of maternal instinct she hadn't realized still existed within her. Her own son, long gone, a ghost in the corners of her cabin, seemed to momentarily materialize beside her, a silent prompt. The wound on his thigh was deep, an angry, gaping mouth. She knew enough of such things from her solitary life to understand the urgency. Ignoring the frantic whispers of her own mind, the cold, logical voice that screamed of Comanche retaliation, of righteous settler fury, she began to gently, carefully, lift him. He was shockingly light, a bundle of bone and sinew, and his head lolled against her shoulder, a dead weight. The journey back to the cabin, a mere quarter-mile, felt like an odyssey through a minefield. Every rustle of leaves, every distant bird call became the harbinger of discovery, of judgment. Inside the cabin, the single room, usually her sanctuary, transformed into a cage of tense anticipation. She laid him on her cot, the rough woolen blanket a stark contrast to his dark skin, and then moved with a practiced, almost clinical efficiency. Water, clean cloths, the crude herbs she kept for ailments. Her hands, usually calloused from work, trembled only slightly as she cleaned the wound, a gruesome, silent ritual. The boy, even in his unconscious state, remained stoic, a testament to a resilience that both awed and terrified her. The only sound was the soft bubbling of water on the stove and the frantic thumping of her own heart, a drumbeat against the impending unknown. She was alone, utterly and irrevocably, with a secret that could unravel her entire world. The stark reality of her actions began to settle in, a heavy cloak woven from fear and a strange, burgeoning sense of responsibility. This small, dark-skinned boy was a profound disruption, a tear in the fabric of her solitary, carefully constructed piece. The first day was a vigil, a slow, agonizing crawl of hours marked only by the shifting angle of sunlight through the cabin's single window. He lay still, a silent, almost ethereal presence, his breath sometimes catching, sometimes fading to an almost imperceptible whisper. Ilara worked around him, her movements hushed, her gaze constantly drawn to his face, searching for any sign of change, any flicker of consciousness. She changed his makeshift bandage, the stained cloth a grim reminder of his peril, and forced sips of water past his dry lips, a desperate attempt to coax life back into his small frame. The cabin, usually filled with the quiet rhythm of her daily tasks, now thrummed with an oppressive silence, broken only by the crackle of the small fire and the incessant thrumming of her own fear. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind against the door sent a jolt through her, tightening her chest, making her instinctively glance towards the rifle leaning in the corner. She imagined the stern, unyielding faces of her neighbors, the condemnation in their eyes if they were to discover her clandestine act of mercy. They would see not a wounded boy, but an enemy, a threat to their tenuous hold on this brutal land. The memory of her husband's grim warnings, echoed by every man she'd ever known on the frontier, about the savages who roamed these plains, clawed at her mind. Yet, looking at the boy, so utterly helpless, those ingrained fears felt hollow, almost cruel. He was a child, not a warring chieftain. A small, ragged sigh escaped him, and his eyelids fluttered open, revealing eyes the color of dark, polished stones. They met hers, wide and unblinking, filled not with fear or aggression, but with a profound, almost startling weariness. No words were exchanged. What words could there be between them? A white woman, an orphaned soul on the periphery of society, and a Comanche boy, a stranger from a world deemed hostile. Yet, in that silent gaze, a fragile thread spun itself between them, thin as a spider's silk, but undeniably present. It was a thread woven of shared vulnerability, of two souls adrift in a vast, unforgiving landscape. He closed his eyes again, but the connection, however fleeting, had been forged. It was a silent conversation, a recognition of shared humanity that transcended the chasm of their different worlds, and it planted a seed of defiant empathy within Ilara's weary heart. The sun began its slow descent, painting the cabin walls in hues of orange and fading gold, casting long dancing shadows that seemed to whisper of the secrets held within its rough-hewn walls. The second day brought a shift, subtle but undeniable. The boy's fever had broken. His skin no longer radiated that alarming heat, and his breathing had deepened, becoming more regular, less fraught. He awoke more frequently, his dark eyes now holding a spark of awareness, a nascent curiosity that probed Ilara's every movement. Still, there was no speech. He ate the meager broth she offered, his movements slow and deliberate, his gaze never leaving her face. She in turn found herself watching him, her initial fear slowly giving way to a strange fascination. His silence was not empty. It was a profound language in itself, filled with observation, with an ancient wisdom that seemed to defy his young age. She saw in his quiet endurance a reflection of the land itself, resilient, unyielding, yet capable of profound stillness. He would watch her as she mended a tear in her dress, as she stoked the fire, as she stared out the window at the endless sky. He was learning her just as she was learning him, not through words but through shared presence, through the silent rhythms of survival. She noticed the intricate beadwork on his moccasins, the faded symbols etched onto the leather of his leggings, fragments of a culture alien to her, yet undeniably beautiful. A memory surfaced, unbidden, of her own childhood, of a time before the harsh realities of the frontier had stripped away all softness. A time when she had dared to dream, to imagine a life beyond the confines of expectation. This boy, a representative of everything she was taught to fear, was inadvertently peeling back the layers of her hardened exterior, revealing the tender, vulnerable core she thought long dead. She found herself reflecting on the absurdities of their world, the arbitrary lines drawn in the dust that decreed one life more valuable, more deserving of safety than another. Her own life, a tapestry woven with threads of hardship and loss, felt oddly connected to his silent suffering. Was not survival, in its rawest form, a universal language? As the afternoon shadows lengthened, the boy, with a slow, deliberate effort, reached out a hand. Ilara tensed, her heart quickening, but he merely pointed a slender finger towards the small hand-carved wooden bird on her makeshift bookshelf. It was a crude piece, a relic from her son's brief childhood. She picked it up, and without a word handed it to him. He turned it over in his hands, his gaze thoughtful, a faint, almost imperceptible smile touching the corners of his lips. It was the first true human gesture between them, a bridge built not of fear or necessity, but of quiet wonder. This shared moment, a simple, wordless exchange over a child's toy, shattered another shard of her carefully constructed walls, leaving her exposed to a tenderness she had long denied herself. The silence that followed was no longer oppressive, but charged with a fragile, burgeoning understanding. The morning of the third day dawned with a sky the color of bruised plums, a heavy, oppressive gray that mirrored the growing tension within Ilara's chest. The air was still, pregnant with unspoken expectation, and the silence around the cabin felt less like peace and more like a held breath. The boy was stronger, undeniably so. He moved with less pain, his dark eyes now alert, assessing, almost watchful. The wound on his thigh, while still raw, was clean, and the swelling had significantly receded. He was ready to leave. This truth, sharp and undeniable, cut through the fragile solace she had found in his quiet presence. Letting him go meant facing the inevitable, the consequence that had loomed over them since that fateful afternoon. The 3 days was a silent countdown that had echoed in her mind, a prophecy whispered by the winds. He had healed under her care, an act of compassion that now felt like an open invitation to catastrophe. She moved about the cabin with an agitated energy, preparing a small meal of hardened bread and dried meat for him, her movements jerky, her thoughts racing. Every fiber of her being screamed for him to simply vanish, to melt back into the landscape from which he came, leaving no trace, no proof of her defiance. But even as that selfish, desperate wish formed, another, more profound emotion warred within her. A strange, fierce protectiveness had bloomed in her heart, a delicate, unexpected blossom in the harsh desert of her life. She found herself imagining the perils he would face out there, alone, vulnerable. Was she sending him to his death? The irony of her situation was a bitter taste in her mouth. She had saved him from one peril only to potentially deliver him into another. He watched her from the cot, his gaze steady, unwavering, as if sensing the tumultuous storm raging within her. Finally, she stopped, turning to face him fully. The words she needed to speak were heavy, choked in her throat. She had to ask, had to know, if his people, if his father, were truly coming. The question hung in the air, a fragile thing that could shatter the delicate peace between them. He met her gaze, and for the first time, a flicker of something akin to sorrow, a deep, ancient sadness touched his features. He raised a hand, slowly, and pointed towards the rising sun, then drew a circle in the air with his finger. Dawn, then pointed to himself, then to the horizon, and back to her, a clear, unmistakable message. His people would arrive with the sun. It was confirmation, chilling and undeniable. The silence that followed was profound, weighted with the knowledge of what was to come. A single tear traced a path down Ilara's dust-worn cheek, a stark testament to the terror that now gripped her, but also to the strange, unexpected grief of an impending separation. The boy, seeing her distress, slowly, deliberately, reached out a small, calloused hand and gently touched her arm, a gesture of comfort that transcended all language barriers, a silent acknowledgement of the bond forged in fear and humanity. It was a fleeting moment, an almost imperceptible connection, yet it burned with an intensity that promised to forever mark the landscape of her solitary heart. The die was cast. The relentless sun, a merciless golden eye, began its ascent, painting the eastern horizon with streaks of blood orange and bruised purple. It was still early, the air crisp with the lingering chill of night, but the light was growing, steadily devouring the shadows. Ilara stood by the window, her hand gripping the rough wooden frame, her knuckles white. Her gaze was fixed on the distant line where the prairie met the sky, searching for any sign, any movement that would confirm the boy's silent prophecy. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird trapped in a cage, each beat echoing the name she had given the fear that had been her constant companion for 3 days: discovery. She had no illusions about what would happen if the Comanche warriors found their missing boy in her care. The frontier was a brutal place, its laws written in blood and suspicion. There would be no questions, no explanations, only the swift, unyielding judgment of a people who had suffered countless betrayals. And yet, she had made her choice, an act of defiant compassion that had irrevocably linked her fate to this small, silent stranger. The boy, surprisingly calm, sat on the cot, his back against the wall, a small, worn leather pouch clutched in his hand. He watched her, his dark eyes reflecting the dawn light, an ancient serenity in his youthful face. He seemed to have made his peace with what was to come, a stark contrast to the tempest raging within her. The waiting was the worst, a slow, agonizing torment that stretched every nerve taut. She found herself repeating phrases in her mind, desperate appeals, justifications that she knew would be useless in the face of ingrained prejudice and the raw power of vengeance. She thought of her son again, a fleeting image of his bright, curious eyes, and a wave of profound sorrow washed over her. Was this her penance? Her final sacrifice? The silence of the cabin was punctuated only by the nervous creak of the floorboards beneath her shifting weight, and the distant, almost imperceptible whisper of the wind across the vast plains. Suddenly, a sound, faint at first, then growing louder, broke the oppressive stillness. A rhythmic thudding, a deep vibration that seemed to travel through the very earth. Hoofbeats, many of them. Her breath caught in her throat, a strangled gasp. They were here. Her gaze flew to the boy. He had not moved, but his grip on the leather pouch had tightened, and his eyes, usually so stoic, held a flicker of intense anticipation. It was a silent acknowledgement, a shared moment of profound gravity. The sound intensified, a thunderous roar growing closer, closer, until it filled the very air around the cabin, vibrating through the walls, through her bones. The ground trembled beneath her feet. Fear, cold and absolute, wrapped its icy tendrils around her heart, squeezing, threatening to shatter her composure. There was no escape, no hiding place in this desolate expanse. The moment had arrived, the climax of her defiant act, and the price was about to be exacted. The thunder of hooves ceased abruptly, replaced by an unnerving, almost predatory silence. Alara felt it before she saw it. A presence, formidable and immense, casting a shadow over her small, sun-drenched world. She dared not move, her body locked in a tableau of petrified stillness. Then, through the single window, she saw them, a phalanx of riders silhouetted against the blinding eastern sun, their forms dark and imposing. 50 warriors, just as the title had warned, their faces painted, their bodies adorned with feathers and leather, their stoic expressions unreadable, terrifying. Each one was a testament to the brutal strength and indomitable spirit of the Comanche nation. And at the forefront, mounted on a magnificent pinto, was a man whose presence commanded the very air around him. He was taller, broader, his gaze sweeping over the cabin with an intensity that seemed to penetrate the rough-hewn walls, directly into her soul. This was the father. His eyes, dark and piercing, held a profound sorrow, an unyielding resolve that spoke of loss and the relentless pursuit of what was his. The air crackled with an almost tangible tension, a palpable sense of menace that seemed to drain all sound from the world. No shouts, no war cries, just the unsettling quiet, the sharp clarity of impending confrontation. Alara felt a tremor run through her, a wave of profound vulnerability in the face of such raw power. Her rifle, which had felt like a meager comfort only moments before, now seemed ludicrously small, utterly useless against such numbers. She was a solitary figure, a tiny flicker of defiance against an overwhelming force. She instinctively moved to stand in front of the boy, a futile, pathetic gesture of protection, but one born of an instinct so deep it transcended all logic. He remained on the cot, his gaze fixed on the powerful figure outside, a complex mixture of reverence and something akin to relief on his small face. Then the man dismounted, his movements fluid and deliberate, the earth itself seeming to yield beneath his weight. He approached the cabin slowly, his eyes never leaving the window, his presence a magnet pulling at every atom of fear within her. He stopped just meters from the door, and the other warriors fanned out behind him, forming an impenetrable semicircle, silent sentinels of his will. The very air seemed to thicken, making it difficult to breathe. The moment had arrived, the reckoning for her audacious act of mercy. It was a confrontation not just between two people, but between two worlds, two deeply ingrained fears, two entirely different interpretations of justice and belonging on this contested land. The silent, almost ritualistic approach of the Comanche chief was far more terrifying than any shouted threat could have been, for it spoke of an ancient, unwavering power. The silence stretched, taut and suffocating, broken only by the rasp of Alara's own ragged breathing. The Comanche chief stood before her door, a towering silhouette against the rising sun, his gaze an unblinking obsidian. His eyes, fixed on her, held a profound weight of expectation, of judgment. She felt stripped bare, exposed to scrutiny that seemed to see through her very soul, to the rebellious act that had brought them to this precipice. There was no aggression in his posture, no immediate threat, only a stillness that was far more unnerving than any overt display of anger. It was the stillness of a predator assessing its prey, or perhaps a judge deliberating a sentence. Then, the boy, with a remarkable strength born of sheer will, rose from the cot. His steps were slow, unsteady, but deliberate. He moved past Alara, ignoring her silent plea for him to stay hidden, to remain out of sight. He walked towards the open doorway, towards the formidable figure of his father, a small yet profoundly significant bridge between two disparate worlds. As he stepped into the light, his father's gaze softened, a flicker of raw emotion momentarily cracking the stoic mask. The boy spoke, his voice raspy from disuse, but clear, in a language Alara did not understand. He spoke of his wound, of his weakness, of the white woman who had found him. He gestured towards Alara, then towards the cabin, his small hands painting a vivid wordless picture of her care, her defiance of convention. He spoke of kindness, of healing, of 3 days spent not in fear but in a strange, fragile sanctuary. The words were alien, but the tone, the reverence in the boy's voice, was universal. The chief listened, his expression unreadable, his eyes occasionally flicking back to Alara, assessing, weighing. He looked at her, then at his son's mended leg, a silent testament to her actions. There was a moment impossibly long, where the fate of Alara, of her small cabin, of her very life hung precariously in the balance. The air vibrated with the unspoken questions, the profound cultural chasm that separated them. The chief finally spoke, his voice a low rumble, resonant and deep, filled with the authority of his position. He spoke in his own tongue, and Alara understood nothing, yet the gravity of his words was unmistakable. His gaze, however, lingered on her, a piercing intensity that demanded an answer, an understanding. He pointed to his son, then to her, then made a gesture that was both question and command, a complex interplay of gratitude and warning. He was asking for an explanation, for the truth behind this unprecedented act. Alara, her voice surprisingly steady despite the tremor in her hands, spoke the only words she knew, the simplest, truest words she could offer. He was hurt. He was just a boy. The stark simplicity of her confession hung in the air, a profound challenge to centuries of animosity. The chief's gaze, which had been unyielding, seemed to soften fractionally at her simple, raw confession. He turned his attention back to his son, a long, assessing look passing between them, a silent communication that transcended spoken words. The boy, in turn, looked from his father to Alara, then back, a subtle movement of his head, a plea for understanding, perhaps even for mercy, on her behalf. The tension, though still present, began to shift, to subtly dissipate, like smoke dispersing in the wind. The chief then spoke again, his voice still deep, but now carrying a different cadence, less a pronouncement, more a question, or perhaps an acknowledgement. He extended a hand, not in threat, but in a gesture that seemed to encompass the cabin, the land, and Alara herself. His eyes, though still intense, held a glint of something akin to curiosity, perhaps even a grudging respect. He was, in his own way, seeking to understand the anomaly before him. A white woman who had chosen compassion over ingrained prejudice, an act almost unheard of in their brutal, unforgiving world. Ilara, her heart still hammering, but a fragile thread of hope beginning to weave its way through her fear, met his gaze directly. She could offer no grand explanations, no eloquent speeches. Her life had taught her the blunt language of survival, the stark truth of human need. She simply stood, her posture conveying a quiet resolve, a refusal to cower. She was not asking for forgiveness, only for understanding, for the recognition of a shared humanity that had momentarily bridged an impossible divide. The chief nodded slowly, a single, deliberate movement that carried immense weight. He then turned to his warriors who had remained silent, watchful throughout the entire exchange. He issued a command, a series of guttural sounds, and the warriors, without a word, began to dismount, their faces still impassive, but their movements carrying a new, almost respectful air. Some began to spread out, securing the perimeter, while others approached the cabin, their movements measured, their intent still unclear, yet no longer overtly hostile. Ilara braced herself, uncertain of what this new development portended. Was this a prelude to invasion, or something else entirely? The chief himself walked closer, his eyes scanning the cabin's simple interior, taking in the sparse furnishings, the evidence of a lonely, hard-scrabble existence. His gaze paused on the small, hand-carved wooden bird on the shelf, the one the boy had pointed to, a tiny detail in a vast and dangerous world. He understood. He saw the threads of a life, not so different in its struggle from his own. The silence, once terrifying, now held a new quality, a precarious peace. The confrontation had not erupted into violence as she had feared. Instead, it had transformed into something else entirely, a fragile, unspoken dialogue between two souls at the edge of two worlds, mediated by the silent courage of a young boy. The chief's gaze, after lingering on the small wooden bird, shifted back to Ilara, and a profound, almost ancient understanding seemed to pass between them. He did not smile, nor did he offer any direct words of thanks in her language, but in his eyes, a depth of gratitude was communicated, stark and clear as the prairie sky. He gestured towards his son, then to himself, and then to the vast expanse outside the cabin, a silent, complex message of lineage, survival, and the enduring power of family. It was a recognition of the profound service she had rendered, an act of mercy that transcended the brutal realities of their existence. Then, with a series of quiet commands, the warriors began to move. They did not ransack her home, nor did they threaten her. Instead, in a testament to the chief's unspoken decree, they brought small offerings, a deer hide, soft and supple, folded neatly, a pouch of dried berries, sweet and dark, a bundle of herbs, fragrant and potent for healing. These were not gifts of appeasement, but gestures of respect, a reciprocal act of generosity in the face of her own. Ilara watched, stunned as the exchange unfolded, the air thick with the unspoken weight of their shared humanity. The boy, his face bright with a quiet pride, stood beside his father, a living testament to the bridge that had been built between two adversarial worlds. His dark eyes met Ilara's, and for the first time, a genuine, joyful smile touched his lips, a silent promise of remembrance. It was a smile that spoke volumes, a profound acknowledgement of the bond they had forged in fear and compassion. The chief, with a final, piercing gaze at Ilara, turned and mounted his horse. His warriors followed suit, their movements swift and silent, merging back into the formidable phalanx. The boy, before mounting behind his father, hesitated for a moment, turning back to Ilara. He lifted his small hand, and with a swift, almost imperceptible motion touched his heart, then pointed to her, then to the horizon, a gesture of profound respect and an invitation to carry this moment with her. Then he was gone, swallowed by the vastness of the plains, a tiny figure on the back of his father's horse, disappearing as quickly as he had appeared. The thunder of hooves, once a sound of dread, now faded into a distant echo, leaving behind an almost deafening silence. Ilara stood in the doorway, the gifts at her feet, the scent of horse and smoke lingering in the air. The sun was fully risen now, painting the cabin and the land in a stark, unforgiving light. The resolution was not one of effusive thanks or lasting peace treaties, but a deeply personal one, etched into the very core of her being. The societal biases, the ingrained fears, had been challenged, if only for a brief, transcendent moment, by an act of simple human kindness. The silence that descended upon the cabin after they left was unlike any silence Ilara had ever known. It was not the familiar, comforting quiet of her solitude, nor the tense, suffocating stillness of fear. It was a silence imbued with profound echoes, vibrating with the ghost of a presence that had disrupted and redefined her world. The dust stirred by 50 horses settled slowly, like a fine layer of memory, covering everything. She stood in the doorway, the sun warming her face, the gifts at her feet, a tangible testament to an impossible encounter. The deer hide felt soft beneath her fingers, a stark contrast to the rough wool of her own blankets. The berries were sweet on her tongue, a taste of a world beyond her own meager provisions. These were not mere objects. They were symbols, indelible marks left by a moment that had irrevocably altered the landscape of her soul. She walked back into the cabin, the familiar space feeling suddenly vast, echoing with the unspoken conversations, the shared vulnerabilities, the tenuous trust that had blossomed within its walls. The cot where the boy had lain, now empty, seemed to hold the faint imprint of his small form, a phantom presence that would forever linger in the corners of her consciousness. Her gaze fell upon the small, hand-carved wooden bird, a relic of her own past, now imbued with a new, unexpected significance. It was a silent witness to a defiance that had defied not only societal norms, but also the very instincts of self-preservation. What she had done, how she had chosen to act, would likely never be understood by her own kind. It was an act born not of heroism, but of a deeper, quieter humanity that had emerged from the crucible of her own isolation and loss. She was still Ilara, a solitary white woman on the high plains, but she was also someone fundamentally changed. The world had expanded, or perhaps her perception of it had. The rigid lines of us and them had blurred, if only for 3 extraordinary days. The starkness of the frontier remained, its dangers undiminished, but her relationship to it, to its inherent complexities and cruelties, had shifted. She now carried within her a secret burden, a memory that would forever distinguish her, mark her as different. It was a silent knowing, a quiet defiance that would guide her remaining days. The hope in this resolution was not a bright, effervescent joy, but a deep, grounded understanding, a quiet strength born from facing profound fear and choosing compassion. It was the hope that humanity, even in its most brutal and divided forms, possessed the capacity for unexpected connection, for grace. The sun continued its climb, a silent, indifferent witness to the vast, unfolding drama of existence on the plains. But for Ilara, its light now seemed to illuminate a world both harsher and infinitely more tender than she had ever dared to imagine.